Welcome back to another episode of Flawless Plan Garage, where today we are once again working on my 1994 Buick Roadmaster station wagon, into which I am attempting to inject a 6.6 liter turbo diesel Duramax V8 and Allison transmission, and it doesn't fit, like nothing fits. But what we're going to attempt to do today is finish up the majority of our work to get a steering rack that can actually kind of fit with the diesel. But first, I've got to tell you about today's sponsor. And today's sponsor is once again the number 3. I apologize for the last video. If you haven't been following along, here's a link to the overall build process so far on this really, really foolish project. But I told you last time that we were brought to you by the number 3 because that's how many steering racks I'd gone through. And then I apologize for leaving both of you faithful viewers hanging because I didn't really explain or show any of that. This time, we're going to make it this time. It's going to make sense. And you'll be filled with the same deep regret that I have.
Okay, so I still need to come up with a way to actually fasten the steering rack to the subframe now that I've pushed a little deeper in there. I had debated on trying to take some of these pieces I had cut off and maybe have them, welded back on somehow to give me a little more meat, because you can see that the bolt is going to need to go through like right about here, right about the place where I've cut it off. In retrospect, what I probably should have done is not cut the entire bracket off, instead cut it off, like about here. But too late now. So I think what I'm going to do now instead is actually make steel brackets to sandwich it rather than try to have, because I can't weld this aluminum and it's probably a little dicey welding this cast aluminum anyway. So instead what I'm going to do is hog this out a bit so I have room for the bolt to go through, and then make a piece of steel to go here to provide like a reinforcement and actually make a sandwich to clamp the whole thing down. And I think what I'll be doing is setting it up so that I have like 2 bolts down here that bolt all the way through to keep it from racking and moving this way, and then the 1 bolt hole to go up here through the steering rack. And where the steel bolts, or where the steel plate bolts all the way through, I'll have a plate on both sides down in there to keep it from just crushing the aluminum. I have made some spacers. So these are just a fraction too long still, but we'll have some steel spacers in there to keep the bolts from compressing the subframe there as well. Okay, so now with our aluminum portion hogged out here to make room for the bolt to be in its appropriate location, I've got my plates. What I did to save a little time, I actually tack welded them to each other before I did all the drilling. Saved a few steps. And in this case, this one's going to go right here. And the top bolt will go through it like so. Then I will put the other holes into the subframe, and then my sandwich plate will go on the other side like so. I think this is probably going to work. And on the other side, I've got a little bit different shaped plate. Just going to drop in here. Go like so, do the same thing. And I'll, once I get it kind of mocked into place, snugged down, then I'll mark and drill the holes in the subframe, and then get my little pieces to fit up inside there to make sure everything's nice and strong. But I think this will do nicely. I think it should locate the steering rack really well without risking any funky aluminum welding and whether or not anything was to crack or have issues there. I think it should be strong. Well, that took a few hours, but I now have holes drilled. I have the plates on both sides. I dialed in my height here to basically be as low as I think I can possibly get away with. So I think I have this side pretty much done. I did also get one of these little sleeves made, and that fits on this bolt down here. I've got another sleeve coming for here, although there is also like the aluminum casting is actually has a piece of webbing that goes all the way across right next to this bolt. So I'm not going to add a lot of strength, but just in case, I'll put a sleeve on this bolt as well. Because as you can see, of course, the actual subframe here is not perfectly vertical. It like angles in towards the top. So when I bolt it flat down below, there's going to be a little space up here, and I just might add a little piece of plate to just make sure I keep the strength that way and it doesn't want to crush when I tighten the bolt down. I think I might also make an angled washer to go in behind here. Grind one to an angle and slide it in there to make kind of an angled spacer. Just keep this all nice and tight and rigid much as I can. Okay, this is the angle I have the chassis at right now, so it's not perfectly level. It's tilted back just a little bit. Take that number off of this number. This is the angle I have the drivetrain sitting at right now. I don't really know what I'll be able to put this at, but a little over 2 degrees seems like a fairly steep angle. That's going to cause issues with the turbo hitting into the firewall. It'll gain me some room in the trans tunnel, but then cost me some ground clearance for the trans pan. But most of all, what an angle like this does is it gains me a bit of space for the steering rack. So this fitting right here, if you can see that on the steering rack, is in a bad spot. The oil pan even cut away, there's room between the pan and the rack, but the fitting sticks right up into where the oil pan needs to be. And I can't really shrink the oil pan down anymore right here because I've got the pump inside the pan right there. And I've got the pickup tube right where the fitting goes right there. So I just do not know how I am going to get a tube onto this fitting, or like another fitting in a 90 or anything, in the less than half an inch of space I have right here, and that's not even counting the room I need for actual piece of aluminum and the oil pan and a little room for the motor to move around. But I think I have a really terrible, flawless plan. And that idea is to cut very carefully and very slowly all the way around the steering rack to essentially make a ring that I can then rotate 90 degrees and weld back together. Now, if you know anything about the inside of steering racks, you already know this won't work. But I, of course, have to learn things the hard way. Well, that experiment cost me $300 or so for a used steering rack. Definitely cannot cut where I cut. this side, actually, I think, you know, maybe you could get away with it. Cut here. There's quite a bit of space inside. Theoretically, you could get it rinsed out and get it clean from any abrasives that ended up in there, and then tack it back together. There's really nothing to that part. But on this side of that fitting is where this seal exists, and by luck, I happen to have cut like exactly into the middle of the seal, right to where the rubber is. So when I separated it, the seal popped out too. There's a little bit more of this aluminum piece that, you know, kind of the retainer for this seal, that's what looks like basically a press fit into this steel outer piece, whatever this outer part of the housing is. And that's pressed into here just a little bit further. You know, if I had cut another 1/4 of an inch closer to the fitting, I might have gotten away with it. But even if I had done so, there's no way I could weld this. To weld this would obviously destroy the rubber and plastic seal inside, which is probably why this isn't welded to begin with. This is obviously press fit this whole steel shaft assembly onto the aluminum housing here. So this is a failed experiment. This flawless plan did not work. However, I think the general idea of relocating the fitting is viable if I could find a way to get it cut off and relocated without destroying the housing.
So I found a pretty good deal on a used C6 Corvette steering rack, and I found a couple threads on Corvette Forum where they said the C5 and C6 racks were interchangeable. So I bought it and then started modifying, where instead of cutting all the way through the rack, I would instead just drill a new hole for the new fitting location, flush everything carefully. I did also use an inside reaming tool to make sure I have a smooth surface for the seal to ride on inside with no burrs from the drilling, and then weld the old hole closed and move the fitting over and weld it to the new hole. Okay, and here's my little contraption for this process. So the garden hose will keep the rag wet and keep water flowing to keep temperature down and avoid violating any seals inside. The air compressor will be blowing air through that little hole and then out this fitting, so that as I cut the fitting off, any dust or debris or dirt will be blown out and away from any of the inside piston related stuff. And then voila, it should come right off. This can't possibly go wrong. Okay, leak test number 287. Let's spray a little degreaser, which is a little tough to breathe, but it bubbles. We shoot some air in here, and we still get bubbles. On the plus side, we're not leaking from the weld over here anymore. So where I've welded it closed, that's good now after 17 attempts. But this side, got one little leak down in here and one up in here. So I need to grind this back some more, lay another bead in there. I think I'm getting close finally. Okay, so test number 375 and a half. There's 100 PSI. And no bubbles. Yes, I did spray it with degreaser off camera. Woohoo! Hey, look at that awesome booger welded ugly hydraulic line fitting that now is where I need it to be. Now I can bolt this rack right into my custom mounts in this chopped up C5 subframe. Incorrect. C6 rack has the mount in a different spot.
Pro tip, never believe anything you read on Corvette forum. Also, maybe, check to see if the thing fits before you spend hours modifying it. Anyway, I got to do it again, and it went a little better the second time. That's three steering racks.
Well, third time's the charm, or at least so we can hope. So after modifying this C5 rack, you can see that I've got some clearance now. This is with the angle of the engine and transmission being set to give me about 1 degree of tilt this direction for my pinion angle. And I've got, a nice amount of clearance now for the oil pan. Feel pretty decent about that. I don't yet have a way. I'm probably going to have to make a new line to reach from this new fitting position back to the original fitting in the steering rack. But otherwise, it's sitting in there. We've got my plates on here, kind of roughly getting the steering rack in the right position. And I think it'll take a little bit more fiddling to make sure that everything is completely tight and flush, to make sure that there's no slop in the mounting of the rack itself. But overall, otherwise, I think we have a steering rack, and I think we have it mounted in the subframe, and I think we have it modified to clear the oil pan. One remaining piece, I will need to get some kind of bump steer kit to space these tie rods relative to the knuckles here, because of the, I forget how much it is, inch or inch and a half down that I've moved here. I'll want to, adapt that same amount to keep all my angles copacetic and not create bump steer issues. But with this setup, I shouldn't have any Ackerman issues, and I think we're going to call this a steering system. So there's obviously still some details to work out with steering, like a steering shaft. I have no idea how I'm going to make that work, but that is a problem for next time. And I've cornered the market on used Corvette steering racks. So if anybody, needs a lightly used, mildly modified steering rack for a Corvette, hit me up. Otherwise, thanks for watching. See you next time.